The chamber was restless, cameras flashing under the cold white lights. Senators shuffled their papers. Staffers whispered behind laptops, and the air crackled with the tension of a high-stakes hearing. At the center of it all sat Representative Ilhan Omar, her voice sharp and confident, slicing through the silence with every pointed remark. She leaned forward, eyes flashing with certainty as if the entire room was her stage. Across from her, Senator John Neely Kennedy sat quietly, almost too quietly. His tortoise-shell glasses caught the light, his pen scratched against a yellow notepad, and his face revealed nothing. To the untrained eye, he looked like a weary old man letting the storm pass him by. But behind those calm eyes, something far sharper was at work. For 20 minutes, Omar dominated the floor. She attacked policies, questioned motives, and spoke, as though she alone carried the moral weight of the nation. The crowd of reporters in the back typed furiously, convinced they were witnessing her victory lap. The atmosphere was electric, but it leaned heavily in her favor. And yet Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't shift, didn't smirk, didn't interrupt. He waited, patient as a man who had seen storms before, and knew that sometimes the strongest strike comes not from volume, but from timing. To those who knew him, this stillness wasn't weakness, it was warning. Then the moment came. Omar's final jab, delivered with a grin, landed squarely in his direction. She mocked his southern drawl, sneered at his old ways, and painted him as irrelevant in a modern America. The chamber buzzed, half with laughter, half with shock. Kennedy looked up slowly, removing his glasses and setting them carefully on the desk. The subtle motion silenced even the whispers. A hush fell over the room. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Omar folded her arms, certain she had cornered him. But what she didn't know, what no one in that chamber knew, was that John Kennedy had been waiting for exactly this moment. And with a single line, one sentence sharpened like a blade, he was about to change everything. The destruction was coming, not loud but devastating. Ilhan Omar straightened her papers, her tone sharpening with each passing second. She wasn't just speaking, she was performing, every sentence crafted to draw gasps, every gesture meant for the cameras. She spoke of broken systems, of failures she claimed were rooted in the very traditions Kennedy represented. Her words carried the weight of accusation, but also the gleam of someone who believed she was untouchable. America needs leaders who understand the future, she declared, her voice echoing off the marble walls. Not relics clinging to the past. The line drew chuckles from a few young aides seated in the gallery. A reporter in the corner whispered to another, "She's landing every punch." The room tilted in her favor. The more she pressed, the more it looked like Kennedy had been reduced to a silent, irrelevant shadow. But Kennedy sat motionless, his pen tapping lightly against the edge of his notebook. He had heard worse. Years in politics had taught him that sometimes the loudest voice is the weakest one, and the calmest silence can be the sharpest weapon. Still, to everyone else, he seemed cornered, a lion chained by age and restraint, letting a younger rival devour the stage. Omar didn't stop there. She mocked his accent, his southern metaphors that once charmed audiences. Folksy sayings might play in Baton Rouge, she smirked, but they don't solve the crises of a nation. The jab landed hard, the chamber buzzing with murmurs. Some smirked, others shook their heads in disbelief at her boldness. Kennedy scribbled something on his pad, tore off the page, and slid it aside. His face was unreadable. Omar pressed on, her voice rising. "You can't hide behind charm, Senator. You can't dance around with outdated phrases while people suffer. This country needs accountability, and it starts with you." The last words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, even her supporters glanced toward Kennedy, waiting for some reaction. He shifted slightly, adjusting his glasses, but said nothing. And that silence, that unbearable, deliberate silence, began to change the energy of the room. Reporters who moments ago were convinced Omar had delivered a fatal blow now leaned forward, sensing something brewing. The aides who laughed nervously before were now fidgeting, glancing at Kennedy's still figure. He looked less like a man defeated and more like a man waiting to strike. Omar, emboldened by what she mistook for weakness, doubled down. "Maybe. It's time we admit it," she said coldly. "Your kind of politics doesn't belong in America anymore." Gasps rippled through the gallery. It was a statement meant to be final, meant to close the debate. She leaned back, folding her arms as though she had placed the last stone on Kennedy's grave. But Kennedy finally looked up. His eyes, calm but sharp, met hers across the chamber. Slowly, almost lazily, he removed his glasses and set them on the desk. The simple act froze the room. No one knew it yet, but the silence that followed wasn't weakness. It was the storm gathering before the lightning. The hearing room felt heavier with every second. Ilhan Omar leaned forward, her voice sharpened like a blade, aimed straight at Senator John Kennedy. The earlier smirk on her face had hardened into something colder. She wasn't satisfied with cornering him. She wanted to dismantle him. "You? Sit there," she began, her tone low but piercing. "Representing an era that should have ended years ago. You and men like you, clinging to your outdated views, hiding behind charm and sayings that sound clever but mean nothing." The words sliced through the silence. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, capturing every line, every barb. Kennedy didn't move. His pen rested against his yellow pad, but he no longer wrote. His eyes, calm and unblinking, stayed locked on Omar. She took his stillness as confirmation of victory. Her voice rose, strong and triumphant. "Tell me, Senator, when was the last time you stood for the people instead of protecting the system that benefits you? Or is silence the only thing you have left to offer?" Gasps erupted across the room. Staffers exchanged looks, some shocked at her bluntness, others secretly thrilled by the drama. Omar had crossed a line, but she didn't care. She smelled blood in the water. Kennedy leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together. His movements were so measured that the silence grew unbearable. Omar pressed harder. "Maybe it's time someone says it plainly. America doesn't need the tired politics of John Kennedy. America needs leaders unafraid to tell the truth. Leaders who know this country's future isn't written in the slow, stumbling language of the past." The chamber buzzed like a hive. Some senators whispered uneasily. Others pretended to stay neutral, their eyes betraying curiosity. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was an ambush. Kennedy, however, remained as still as stone. He let Omar's words hang in the air, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Finally, Omar delivered what she believed was her knockout blow. She leaned closer, eyes flashing, and declared, "You're a relic, Senator, and the only thing history will remember about you is that you sat silent while the world passed you by." The words landed like thunder. The crowd sucked in a collective breath. Even the reporters, trained to remain detached, felt the sting of the insult. All eyes turned to Kennedy. Would he finally answer? Would he break under the weight of her attack? But Kennedy didn't rush. He reached for his glasses, slid them off, and folded them carefully beside his notes. The gesture was deliberate, unnerving. He looked up, and for the first time he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the chamber like a low rumble before a storm. "Ms. Omar," he said softly, almost kindly, "you've said a great deal tonight, more than you realize, but sometimes the loudest speeches come from the weakest positions." The room went still. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Omar blinked, her composure wavering just slightly. Everyone felt it. The air had shifted. The confrontation was no longer hers to control. The chamber hung in a fragile silence, as if every breath in the room had been stolen. John Kennedy's words, quiet, measured, and unexpected, had already shifted the ground beneath Ilhan Omar's feet. She opened her mouth to answer, but for the first time all evening her words didn't come instantly. Kennedy didn't press. He simply adjusted his papers, leaned back in his chair, and let the silence stretch. He had been in politics long enough to know the value of a pause. Sometimes silence wasn't weakness, it was a weapon. The tension grew unbearable. Reporters stared at him, pens hovering above notepads, unsure whether to write or wait. Staffers leaned forward in their seats, their whispers dying in their throats. Even Omar's supporters in the gallery fidgeted nervously, sensing something shift in the air. Finally, Omar forced a laugh, thin and brittle. "So that's it, Senator? That's your defense, a vague proverb?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying an unease she hadn't shown before. Kennedy didn't look rattled. He leaned forward now, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes, calm but sharp, locked onto hers. "No, ma'am," he said softly. That was just the beginning. The words sent a shiver through the chamber. Omar straightened, masking her nerves with defiance. "Then say what you mean. Don't hide behind your southern charm. Don't play games. If you have something to say it." Kennedy didn't move right away. He folded his glasses neatly, slid them into his breast pocket, and then placed both hands flat on the desk. The deliberate slowness was excruciating. Every second stretched longer than the last. Around them, the room was utterly still. The cameras zoomed in. Even the clicking of keyboards had stopped. Everyone waited, breath held, for the moment that was about to come. Kennedy finally spoke, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of certainty. "You know," he began, "my daddy used to say a person can talk for hours and never say a thing. And sometimes a single sentence tells you everything you need to know." He let the line sink in, his gaze never leaving Omar's. Omar smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Is this where you try to wrap me up in another one of your sayings, Senator?" Kennedy's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Not a saying, ma'am, just a truth." And then he stopped again. The silence that followed was thunderous. It wasn't empty. It was electric, humming with the anticipation of 1,000 unseen sparks. Reporters leaned forward, ready to capture the blow. Staffers braced, sensing history in the making. Even Omar, arms crossed tightly, couldn't fully disguise the tension in her posture. The storm was here, circling in the air, and everyone knew it. They just didn't know what form it would take. John Kennedy took a slow sip of water, placed the glass back on the desk, and fixed his eyes, once more on Omar. The chamber was his now. The destruction wasn't loud. It was waiting, sharpening itself in the silence. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Every ear in the chamber strained toward Senator Kennedy, waiting for the words they sensed were about to change everything. Ilhan Omar shifted in her chair, her smirk frozen in place, but her eyes flickered with unease. Kennedy leaned forward slowly, his voice calm, unhurried, the drawl of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. "Congresswoman," he said, the syllables steady as stone, "you keep talking about what's wrong with America. But the fact that you can stand here, speak freely, and even insult the country that gave you a seat in this chamber proves America isn't broken. It proves you are ungrateful." The words detonated like a bomb. Gasps erupted. The chamber froze, then rippled with shock. Some senators shifted uncomfortably. Others sat back, stunned. Reporters' keyboards clattered furiously as they scrambled to capture the sentence before it escaped them. Staffers' jaws dropped, and Omar faltered. Her lips parted as if to respond, but nothing came. The sharp, rehearsed certainty she carried all evening cracked in an instant. She blinked rapidly, her hands tightening around her papers as if the very weight of them might steady her. Kennedy didn't press the attack. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat back, folded his hands, and let the echo of his line hang in the air. That restraint made it even more devastating. For a moment, the room was silent, not out of respect, but out of sheer disbelief at what had just been said. And then it began. Murmurs spread like fire through the chamber. Reporters leaned into each other, whispering about the line that would dominate headlines by morning. Phones buzzed in the gallery as staffers texted frantically. On social media, clips of the moment were already being uploaded. The caption, inevitable. Kennedy ends Omar with one line. Omar attempted to recover, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. "So that's your point? Call me ungrateful?" she said, her voice thinner now, her command slipping, but Kennedy didn't even glance her way. He picked up his pen, resumed scribbling calmly on his yellow pad, as if she no longer existed. His dismissal was worse than any insult. He had reduced her from a commanding presence to background noise. The chamber felt it. Everyone felt it. One line had shifted the entire balance of power. Reporters began typing feverishly. "Kennedy silences Omar." "Ungrateful," the line that shook. "The House," staffers muttered in disbelief. Even Omar's supporters sat stiffly, their expressions uneasy. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a judgment. Sharp, undeniable, and final. For Omar, it was more than embarrassment. It was exposure. Her authority, her aura of control, had cracked on the national stage. She could fire back with speeches and statistics later, but nothing would erase that moment. The look on her face, the silence that followed, and the truth Kennedy had laid bare. In the end, it wasn't volume that destroyed her. It wasn't anger, or insults, or shouting. It was a single, perfectly timed line, a scalpel, not a hammer, that cut deeper than anything else could. And John Kennedy, slipping his glasses back on, sat quietly once again. The storm had passed, but its wreckage was plain for all to see. The chamber erupted like a dam bursting. Murmurs, whispers, gasps. The sound swelled into chaos. Reporters who only moments earlier had been confidently writing Omar's victory now scrambled to rewrite their headlines. Pens scratched furiously. Cameras zoomed in and phone screens glowed as staffers pushed out breaking alerts. Kennedy ends Omar with one line. Ungrateful, the word that shook Congress. The phrases spread faster than fire in dry grass. On the Senate floor, Omar struggled to regain her composure. She shuffled her papers, lifted her chin, and forced herself to speak. "Senator," she began, voice trembling despite her efforts. "That's an insult, not an argument." But her words landed limp, lifeless. The crowd wasn't listening. The energy had shifted. Even those who disagreed with Kennedy felt the weight of what had happened. It wasn't about policy anymore. It was about perception, and perception had turned against her. Kennedy didn't look at her. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't even acknowledge her attempt to respond. He simply slid his pen across his notes and leaned back in his chair. The picture of quiet finality. It was as if with one sentence he had dismissed her from relevance. That silence, his refusal to spar further, was more humiliating than any follow-up attack. In the gallery, aides whispered frantically, some wide-eyed, others grim. "She's finished," one muttered. "That line's going viral before she even leaves the building." Another staffer, barely containing a grin, whispered, "Career ending. That's what this is." The cameras caught everything. Omar's tight jaw, her clenched fists, the faint shimmer in her eyes she tried desperately to hide. By the time the session adjourned, the narrative had already been written. Clips of Kennedy's line flooded social media, viewed millions of times within hours. Twitter, now X, trended with hashtags. Kennedy line, Omar destroyed. Ungrateful news anchors replayed the moment on loop, their voices tinged with awe. "It was surgical," one commentator said. "Kennedy didn't just debate her, he dismantled her." Another added, "This wasn't politics, this was a reckoning." Omar walked briskly out of the chamber, cameras swarming, microphones shoved toward her face. "Do you have a response to Senator Kennedy's remark?" one shouted. She kept her gaze down, lips pressed tightly, refusing to answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Kennedy exited calmly, surrounded by a quiet respect. He offered no extra comments, no interviews, no victory lap. Just a simple nod to a colleague and the slow, measured stride of a man who had said all he needed to say. The contrast was stark. One walked out diminished, the other elevated. That evening, networks opened with the clip. The single line was repeated across headlines. America isn't broken. You're ungrateful. Analysts debated its meaning, but no one denied its impact. Even critics admitted that Omar's standing had been shaken, and for Omar, the damage was deeper than politics. It wasn't just a tough day at work, and it was a blow to her image, her credibility, her aura of invincibility. One moment of silence, one perfectly timed line had undone years of cultivated presence. Kennedy didn't destroy her with volume. He destroyed her with restraint, with patience, with one sentence that America wouldn't forget. And by morning, everyone knew her career would never be the same. By the next morning, the moment had become legend. Kennedy's single line was no longer just a quote from a Senate hearing. It was a symbol, replayed across every television channel, dissected on talk shows, and shared endlessly online. Anchors called it the moment that ended the debate before it began. Commentators described it as a strike so precise it turned into a verdict. The clip of Ilhan Omar blinking in stunned silence while Kennedy's calm voice carried across the chamber had already amassed millions of views. On social media, the hashtags hadn't slowed. The Kennedy line, ungrateful, Omar destroyed for Omar. The fallout was brutal. Editorials questioned her composure. Allies grew quiet. Even supporters admitted privately that the optics had been devastating. Her speeches in the days that followed felt defensive, strained, as though every word was shadowed by the one she could never erase. It wasn't her policies that were under attack now. It was her credibility, her very ability to command a room. Meanwhile, Kennedy remained silent. He didn't hold a press conference, he didn't brag or amplify the moment. He simply returned to his work as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That restraint made the impact even stronger. The less he said, the more powerful the moment became. For many, the moral was clear. True strength doesn't need to shout. Sometimes the loudest message is delivered in the fewest words. At town halls across his state, people repeated the line with pride. "That's the America we believe in," one voter said. Grateful, proud, unshaken. Others spoke of how Kennedy's calm composure reminded them that leadership isn't about noise. It's about clarity, timing, and courage. And for young watchers, students, aspiring leaders, even ordinary citizens, the lesson was unforgettable. In a world where arguments drown each other out, one man showed that silence, patience, and a single sentence could outweigh an hour of shouting. For Omar, it was more than a political wound. It was a lesson in underestimating an opponent. She had mistaken Kennedy's stillness for weakness, his age for irrelevance, his silence for surrender. And in doing so, she walked directly into the moment that undid her. The image remained etched in memory. The quiet senator setting aside his glasses, speaking softly, and leaving an entire chamber and a career in stunned silence. In the cap, and it wasn't rage or volume or spectacle that carried the day. It was restraint, it was timing. It was the power of one line. And as the echoes of that moment settled into history, the narrator posed the question that lingered in every viewer's mind. If you had the chance to speak truth to power, would you shout 1,000 words? Or would you dare to deliver just one line the world could never forget?